Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I had a panic because I just saw that Symposium was misspelled on my first slide, which is previously hanging out under one of my logo leaves. I'm really delighted to be here. My background is actually in uh, fluvial geomorphology. So I'm really stepping out of my expertise here, but I work in a generalist way, thinking about climate trends on our water cycle, and how that impacts our ecosystems and how it can be applied to agriculture. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you today. And if you don't remember anything else from my lecture, the take-home message really is our region is getting more arid. I'm going to give a bunch of examples today from Sonoma County, but of course we're seeing similar trends. So we'll talk about that, how we're measuring it, how we can conceptualize it, and some tools that may be available, that are available that may be applicable to some of the questions you're asking yourselves in the context of agriculture. So now I just have to make sure I know how to go forward in this brave new world. I think it's the two screen thing. Okay, so if you don't know about Pepperwood, you haven't heard about us, we were a 3,200 acre reserve that was established with the California Academy of Sciences. And in 2009, we became our own foundation and opened this center. This is a picture of the center right after it was constructed. And we've become a hub for meetings like this, when we used to meet in person, and then a place where we are measuring all the different aspects of climate change in real time on our natural ecosystem. We do also support a grass-fed beef operation on site as part of our stewardship of 900 acres of grasslands. The work I'm sharing today really comes from a bunch of colleagues that were brought together through the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation in 2010, and we were asked to collaborate across boundaries. So this is a group of hydrologists, ecologists, plant specialists, coastal modelers, fog modelers, and the Moore Foundation asked us to think about what's the impact of climate looking like for the wild and working lands of the Bay Area. And so I give credit to this whole group, and you can learn a lot more about them on our website. So I'm just going to go quickly through sort of historic and projected temperature and rainfall trends for Sonoma, and introduce this idea of climatic water deficits, which many of you may be familiar with. I often call them soil water deficits. And this is a term that actually brings together the combined effects of warming and rainfall variability. And then I'll show you where you can explore more of this data on your own, and I'll be available for any questions. So I decided to tap into this website. It's called the Sonoma County Climate Resilience Dashboard. It was created as a prototype for the National Partnership for Resilience and Enhanced Preparedness. It's a site that you can revisit, that summarizes results that we made for Sonoma and the Russian River. We do have similar data available now for all of California as well as the US West. So I'll talk more about that. But the take home to start with is that our climate is getting warmer and more variable in terms of rainfall. So these are two typical plots. We have the data from 1920 to about 2000, which is the historic data, and then a set of projections on the rainfall. And we don't know in our region whether we're going to, on average, get more rainfall or less rainfall. The challenging part of it is that we're actually looking at more extreme events. So when we run these models, we're seeing maybe double as many flood years as we had in the historic, previous 100 years, and 60% drought years across models. And those are very rough numbers, suggesting that basically we just have more uncertainty and probably more extreme events punctuating our precipitation record. And then down below, you're seeing the historic trends of temperature and projected temperature trends with fuzz around them. And I think it's just a different, it's an important take-home message that we know that the temperatures are increasing. The uncertainty is about how fast that is happening, but we don't know which direction the rainfall is going. And that is because in terms of accumulating emissions in our environment, we have a good model that's quite rigorous about how that affects the warming effects, but there's really just a lot of uncertainty about the mechanisms underlying rainfall. This is a slidey tool. I was not brave enough to try to do a slidey tool in the presentation, but I fast forwarded all the way to 2070, 2099. And all of this kind of climate projection work that we do is done in 30-year increments, which is sort of you can think of that as one data point for looking at long-term trends. And these are models that we've developed with the US Geological Survey, which are publicly available. And where we have observed the greatest warming to date is actually in our winter temperatures. Our winter and our nighttime temperatures are warming faster than our daytime temperatures and our summer temperatures. This shows you the pattern of where certain thresholds are exceeded by end of century in terms of monthly temperature averages. And I think a take home is just that when you compare that to the daytime temperatures and the summer temperatures, it's a different pattern. So in terms of whether your crop or your ecosystem of interest is more sensitive during the summer or during the winter, you might see a different pattern in terms of the degree of warming that we're going to experience in the landscape. This is a visualization of an atmospheric river. These storms that form over the middle of the Pacific Ocean and then drench us, they can carry up to 35 times the amount of water in the Mississippi River. And they're very, very difficult to predict because they form quickly and they literally meander through the sky. And that's the source of the uncertainty really and how much rainfall we're going to get over the long run. We don't even really have the ability to predict the behavior of these in a quite short-term period or exactly where they're going to land. So just to keep in mind the mechanism behind the rainfall uncertainty. When we're looking at climate change and water supply, the model that I'll be introducing, we can look at both surface runoff and recharge. And one of the take homes when we're working with communities is just to realize that our groundwater recharge is relatively constant and relatively resilient with respect to these variations in rainfall. And that makes it all the more important, all the groundwater protection work that we're doing right now to protect that source. And you can use runoff that's available to fill ground on an annual basis, brings that idea home that it's our savings account. So we mentioned more frequent and severe droughts. And one of the concepts I'm going to try to bring across today is the difference between a water supply drought and a landscape drought. And we've learned a lot about this looking at the 5-year drought that started around 2011. And we're still seeing, of course, droughty years happening right now. So we use a US Geological Survey model called the Basin Characterization Model. And it basically keeps track on a grid cell basis of the impacts of temperature and the solar radiation combined with precipitation on the ground surface. And we use a model, a watershed model that has the topography, the thickness of the soil layer, and then the underlying geologic material with estimates of the permeability of that groundwater material. And it does estimate how much water goes into deep storage versus being discharged to the streams. And the stream discharge is one of the ways that we validate this model and make sure that the model stream discharge matches what's happening. At Pepperwood right now, we're actually putting in a flux tower that will directly measure evapotranspiration from the soils and the plants. And we'll talk more about why we feel like that's so important to get right. So water deficit, and I'm sure many of you are much more expert soil scientists than I am, but we estimate this term using the potential evapotranspiration, which is the amount of evaporation that would happen if you just had a bucket or a tray of water out and water was unlimited based on the temperature and the solar radiation. How much evapotranspiration would you expect? And then the nice thing about our basin characterization model is we actually keep track of soil storage over time. So at any particular moment in either history or the model, we have an estimate of how much water is in the soils. So if you think about the dry down summer season, we're depleting that stored water out of the soils, and there's a point at which you're going to run out of it because it is not an unlimited supply. And so it's that delta between the potential and the actual that we term the climatic water deficit. And it's an indicator of drought stress. And so I'll just say from an ecosystem point of view, this became a game changer when our hydrologists were able to estimate and map climatic water deficit. It explained why different kinds of natural vegetation in the Bay Area can occupy the positions that they do. And we were able to much better estimate with David Ackerley's lab, who's at UC Berkeley. He's now the Dean of College and Natural Resources, to much better estimate where plants can grow. Because obviously in a water limited environment, your tolerance for different levels of deficit will open up different landscapes. And a lot of it has to do with how much water can be stored in the soil, and in particular soil depth as a driver of that. But when we fast forward the models, and we have worked with 100 different models, I'm using one or two just to show, but we're looking at perhaps a 10 to 20% drier situation by 2100, where the water deficits add up to about 3 to 6 inches of incoming rainfall. So that's a pretty big difference to make up. And again, this is a more extreme model. We could have milder effects, but it sort of gives you the range of how much liquid water that used to be in the soil will more typically already be in the atmosphere. One of the things I like maps, is we can map water deficits across the landscapes. These are some of the early estimates we did. But the other thing to think about is that these inland areas, and this is actually Pepperwood, our property over here, yes, they're subject to a lot of water deficit change, but they also are relatively high water deficit areas to start with. So we started thinking about, perhaps there's more vulnerability in the coastal areas, which normally don't see much change in climatic water deficit, that maybe small changes there could have big impacts. The other thing is when you start doing the math about water deficits, on the left-hand side, these are all the different basins: Marin, Petaluma, Sonoma, Napa, different places where before coming to Pepperwood, was particularly working on stream restoration type projects. So we wanted to differentiate between the different valleys. But then when you plot water deficits, especially in the second half of the century, the impacts in water deficit are accelerating faster than temperature. So that seemed like an important take-home message to bring. We also started working on visualizations like this that show you the trade-offs in different elements of the water balance over time. On the left-hand side, we're looking at our home watershed, Mark West Springs watershed, from the average from 51 to 80. And we've got the actual evapotranspiration in green, runoff in dark blue. That's the medium blue, recharge in dark blue, and the accumulation of soil storage over the season. And then you can see this dry down period. And we started plotting the water deficit as it accumulated during the dry season, which gives you a visual of how in a warmer future environment, we're going to see those deficits grow. And there is a link to this particular tool. You can download any sub-watershed in actually the entire Bay Area and have a chance to see the historical and projected numbers yourself, look at the monthly values, etc. So when I talk about different kinds of drought, and this really was a big take home during our most recent drought, we often think about the drought is a drought when the reservoirs are low. And reservoirs generally capture surface runoff and shallow recharge. And that's super important because of folks who rely on those reservoirs for water supply. But then the landscape droughts, which are really the drought effect that climatic water deficit is measuring, what we started to realize is that in a super droughty situation, you could actually be accumulating deficits from year to year. So if the soil dries out extensively in a particular year, and we only get, say, 7 inches of rainfall, which is where we were at Pepperwood last week, you might actually never completely replenish the soils and get them back to a zero deficit condition. So this was an important thing that we realized could help differentiate people's understanding of drought and really some of the lasting impacts of drought that can occur on agricultural and forested lands that we hadn't necessarily accounted for. The other thing we're showing in this little visualization is 1977 and 2014 had relatively similar rainfall totals, but the amount of warming that we've had just in that small window, which is only about 1 degree Celsius really on these average temperatures, created a drier condition for our region. So same amount of rainfall, but drier condition because of the warming trends that we're seeing. I also thought this was a neat visualization. This is, again, looking at one water year, 2013-14. And on the left-hand side is what we would generate for, say, the water agency to understand the difference in terms of water supply relative to our pre-change average. But then on the right-hand side, then we're mapping what is the water deficit condition and how dry are these soils. So 2 different metrics of drought that we could be thinking about. I mentioned this idea of where climatic water deficit exceeds historical variability. This is something we can map. This is taking 1 standard deviation as the threshold. So anything gray is staying within 1 standard deviation of change. And this is a mid-century versus end of century comparison. And it was interesting because when we first started working down here in the southern part of our region, this is the North Coast region, I should clarify, going from Sonoma County all up to the Oregon border, we saw this sensitivity along the coastal areas. And again, they are going to go outside of their historic range faster than the interior. However, as you get further north in our region, that is a flip-flop situation. So you can see there's some value to using these high resolution climatic projections to understand the variability of the landscape. So once we get this water balance model going, and it is, I said, publicly available to U.S. Geological Survey, there's other applications we do in terms of our ecosystem work. We can model river discharge. We can look at vegetation exposure. There's actually a statewide California report that one of our team members did for Fish and Wildlife, looking at vegetation exposure. And then we can also use CWD ends up being one of the major predictors of fire hazard. Because we're doing some work right now about how the climatic water deficits in the soils correlate to the live fuel moisture and the degree of desiccation in the leaves of the vegetation. Just some other proof of concept we did when we were working with Sonoma Water, for example, taking historical records of irrigation demand out of the Russian River and projecting that for future climate to understand how irrigation demand may increase. So we think that that's pretty directly related to water deficit estimates. I mentioned the ability to model where natural vegetation will be able to persist in the future. And of course, that is a really different picture, whether we end up in a wetter scenario or a drier scenario. Personally, I have a feeling we're going towards the drier scenario, so we can think about the changes in natural cover. And again, the fire models, we came out with these fire models in 2016, right before almost everything in heavy red on the right-hand side of the map burned. And then, of course, last year we started catching up on some of these dark red areas on the other side.
Lisa?
Yes.
Yeah, you're doing great. You got 10 minutes for your presentation, then question and answer.
Okay, great. Just letting you know that we are working a lot on habitat corridors and land connectivity. And it's definitely the mosaic of agricultural and working lands that enable us to conserve landscapes and create basically climate adaptation pathways for some of the wildlife we're worried about in the landscape. But I see CWD, the drought hazard, and also the fire hazard as an overlay that we need to put on these kinds of concepts about habitat connectivity and seeing the functionality of ag lands to buffer some of our areas, particularly with respect to fire. And some of our team members have done work specifically for grape varietals, coordinating water deficit and temperatures with historical grape ripening dates and starting to look at the suitability. And I think that this is a great a great example of how the climate gradient in our area at the sort of county or regional scale is really a east to west gradient. So, I think people typically think about climate to cool off. You go up the mountain or you head north. But here in our region, we actually head towards the coast. And what this map showed us is that there's going to be a lot more areas that will be suitable for grapes towards the coast in the future. That's the trend that we're on. And that there may be areas in the interior that start to become perhaps too hot, at least for the varietals that are growing there. And I know it's a big topic of inquiry within the vintners community right now. And I have vintner friends who are testing different varietals, say in the Napa Valley, to see what's going to be robust in the climates to come. So I am a real believer in the fact that everything I just showed you in terms of models in the future are hypotheses. At Pepperwood, we have 17 soil moisture probes actually installed as of right now. We are really interested in this question of the water balance in our rangeland soils, which really are classically similar to most agricultural soils in the area. One of the things we discovered, for example, is that this black dashed line had been considered before our big drought, 5-year drought, the lowest that water potential could go in the soils. And the benefit of actually measuring it was to realize in these new hyper drought conditions that the soils can get drier than we thought was physically possible. And we have now been able to adjust the models to reflect that reality. And this is just showing you the data that we've been continuing to collect, really trying to drill down into the impact of individual precipitation events on the soil moisture. So these little spikes are rainfall events that we're capturing at our weather stations. And then each of these lines is actually a different soil moisture probe at variable depths. And so we're really interested in analyzing what we're calling these sort of dry down periods, looking at the influence of antecedent soil moisture, the soil moisture that's already in the ground, on the ability of the soils to serve as a reservoir over time. And then looking at those very dry conditions, how quickly do things drop down? How much does it, depend on the rainfall that we've gotten? And how much does this vary across the landscape? And we just submitted, as I mentioned, the connection to live fuel moisture, a proposal to be measuring live fuel moisture and vegetation water potential in our natural vegetation types during this period, so we can tighten up that relationship. Another area of TBC3 study is the frequency of fog. Fog is actually a very unknown factor in terms of how it might change over time with climate change. There are some models that think we'll get more. There's some models that think we get less, but certainly fog is our natural air conditioning. It can reduce climatic water deficit in soils by both, impeding or preventing or reducing the incoming solar radiation hitting a patch of soil. But then also the fog can be a direct water source to redwoods and others that know how to harvest the fog. And that's something that we're measuring. We have a station at Bodega Bay and we have a station inland at Pepperwood looking at the actual liquid water content in our fog and tracking that over time. One of the tools I like, if you are not a mathy person and you just want to say, hey, what's the bottom line in terms of what Lisa is saying about the future of our region? We did an analysis with Sam Veloz at Point Blue where we looked at the current landscape and we classified it in terms of the winter minimum temperature, the summer maximum temperature, water deficit, and precipitation. And the areas that are most like us in the future are really San Bernardino County, Santa Barbara County, these red dots down here, under the drier and hotter rainfall, we will be looking at conditions more similar to this area. So, we might want to be thinking about in the long term, how do we gracefully adapt to a transition to this drier environment? How do we increase the water holding capacity of our soils and work on our water security? These are the different tools I mentioned. The Climate Smart Watershed Analyst has monthly time series going back through time and forward through time. For 18 scenarios, there are 100 scenarios for the globe. These are the 20 we felt provided a full set of variability or possible conditions for our area. So you can click on your watershed and get reports. And all of our work is really at this climatecommons.site. If you want to play with the dashboard that I showed, it's here. And if you want to download all of the BCM data, it's also available through the Climate Commons. Here's the landing page for the Bay Area tool. And here's an example of how you can turn on and off these different time steps. And this is the tool that had that seasonal plot of CWD to tap into. And then there's a lot of data that's made available through CalAdapt. It tends to be a larger scale, many data sets, but it gives you a chance if you want to look outside this region to find resources. So that's it. The take home is really, we're looking at more arid conditions. How do we work together to manage our resources under that situation? And with that, I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Lisa. You came in a little ahead of schedule and great presentation. As someone who could talk about the weather all day long, that gave me a whole lot to think about, and I have a whole lot of questions. I do encourage people to put your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom right. And then Katie, you will be leading the question and answer session, so take it away.
Thanks so much, Dr. McKelly. We do have a few coming in. One is, does Pepperwood measure rangeland evapotranspiration via surface renewal or other methods?
So the only direct measures of evapotranspiration are these flux towers I just mentioned, and they're actually both in forested watersheds. So one is a thinned watershed and one is a non-thinned watershed. So we're really trying to look at the comparison of that. We do have, as I said, 17 weather stations primarily in our rangelands, and that's where we can do really high quality estimates of the evapotranspiration, but we're not measuring it directly, but we have all the ingredients to use the Penman model to make a good estimate.
Great, thanks. Could you talk a bit more? Oh, I'm sorry, did you have more to add to that?
No.
Oh, okay. Could you talk a bit more about the connectivity in the wildlife corridors and where someone might look for more information or existing models on that?
I love this question. So we just published 2 articles in a journal called Land. And if I can figure out how to do it, I will put the links in this chat box to the journal Land. And it's called the Mayacamas to Berryessa Connectivity Network. All of that data that's relevant is also on the BIOS database of California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So if you have any trouble accessing that, please do just contact me with this contact information and I'll make sure you can get it. We're really proud of it. And we really are, I think, the only ones who've measured sort of the climate adaptation value of the connectivity. So we're proud of that. And then we also talk about how we worked with stakeholders to come to design these habitat corridors. So.
Excellent, thank you. How does the CWD look into this spring versus like the last spring?
This is where I wish I had time to do some math for you, but I can guarantee you that this spring is drier right now. As I mentioned, we only had 7 inches of rainfall as of last week. I am so happy that we've gotten these storms coming in right now, but we're very concerned about the extent of drought this year. It seems much more extreme than last year, but if we have a miracle March, that could really do a lot of good. And the timing of rainfall is really important in terms of that end of season climatic water deficit, because if you do get your rainfall for the same amount of rainfall, if you get more of it later in the season, you will see lower deficits in the fall. So that's a great question to raise. I see the question from Jack about relating to aquifer recharge. Jack, there should be a basin characterization model for you anywhere. If you are in the Bay Area, I want you to use that tool that I just showed you. But basically, we can make a map of recharge potential and the units are millimeters per year. So it's an estimate of recharge potential. It doesn't necessarily quantify exactly what's going to get into your aquifer. It's quantifying what's recharging below the soil layer into the weathered bedrock. So you generally, if you're really wanting to be very precise about the amount of water in the aquifer, you need to add what they call a GS flow model to it. And that is how, at least in this region, most of the groundwater plans are using the basin characterization model to estimate that surface recharge and then coupling it with a GS flow model below. But if you have your property, we have like a 30-meter layer that would enable you to see the variability of groundwater recharge potential across your property. Do you want to take the next one, Katie? Because I'm probably losing them.
Let me ask this one. Is measuring water table depth instructive regarding climate water deficit? And would you say there's a correlation there?
No, I would say they're not necessarily correlated. So the water table depth will give you a good estimate of where the standing water is, irregardless of the soil bedrock transition. The water deficit is really driven by what's happening in that top layer of soil, regardless of what's happening underneath it. So I don't think the soil sees the water table per se in terms of water deficit. However, the soil, of course, is what's delivering the water to the water table. So I'd say it almost goes the other way around, that in high deficit years, you'd probably be getting less throughput to the water table. But it by itself doesn't necessarily drive what's happening above it.
Great, thanks. And this is a follow-up question, but are your weather stations and Penman stations compatible with the SEMIS protocol station setups? Again, pasture grazing settings, and are they clear of trees and wind turbulence? It's kind of a complex question. But
yeah, I believe so. I don't know all the SIMS protocols exactly, but I can definitely answer this question if I talk to our tech. But I believe that we're meeting all the highest standards in terms of open territories for the stations not having weird wind effects that would mess up the anemometers. We definitely mow around all our stations, and since we do have active cattle grazing, they're also fenced. So they're fenced, cleared, mowed, etc. In some cases, we put weather stations under the trees because we want to see what the impact of the trees is on them, but everywhere else where we're looking for straight weather data, we're definitely out in the open.
Great. I'm going to switch gears a bit to a little bit of a broader question, but could you summarize maybe your top 3 to 5 takeaways for wine growers based on all this climatic data and the predicted changes, and how might they adapt based on this?
Well, my first take home is, as outside of the wine industry, a benefit for everyone in the community is to understand that a lot of our grape growing operations are on important recharge areas, particularly alluvial fans that are well-drained soils where you see the creeks dry out. And personally, I feel like this is a great win-win solution because we have a valuable crop and it's also a relatively low chemical use crop, and it's a great way to keep our aquifers protected and our recharge protected. And I often counsel people that if you're anti-vineyard, the next thing that's going to come in is a housing development, and that is not going to be as functional for our aquifers. I have a question for you all, which is this real emphasis lately on the idea of carbon additions and the ability for carbon additions through either composting. Of course, we have a major forest thinning product problem happening where there's a lot of basically slash that needs to come out of the forest. You know, are there potentials, are there opportunities to augment the soils with carbon and increase the water holding capacity? That was the subject of a big analysis for the fourth climate assessment for California that the BCM modeler sort of took on, which is where are the soils thick enough where you could have an impact if you could add carbon. And if that's something that's a win-win, again, for the growers, it's also a win-win, I think, for our community because you're keeping more water in storage in the watershed for release later. And then, I think about having worked before I came to Pepperwood, I worked in the Rutherford Reach with growers on a major restoration project for the Napa River. What are the things you can do on site? And I know there's a lot of experiments happening with orientation of vines and pruning strategies to keep your grapes at the right temperature and to protect against this incoming solar radiation. And I also think the question is, are there varietal changes that you might want to be considering? And I know, for example, at Larkmead, since they're not going to move to another property, right? I think you have two different situations. If you're the farmer who's staying on your farm, you're going to adapt there. I know that some of the bigger companies already are looking at their portfolio, like should they have more lands further north um, to be able to adapt to the situation. So those are sort of my three biggies, I guess.
It's excellent. Thank you. I will say someone's posed this response to one of your questions, and it's something that popped up too, is this big interest in biochar. And I know that people are starting to study that more in our region. So that could be an interesting thing to continue to study to see if it makes sense in our viticulture systems.
Yeah, I think biochar is great. I think the challenges with these things are like, how do we get the material to the biochar unit and then get it back to where it needs to be without having a bigger carbon footprint than we started with?
Absolutely.
And so I'm really interested. I know that there's portable biochar units. That might be a great option. But yes, we're curious about that. And we have tried, because we can't haul out all the materials in our forest, we are trying to do biochar style burns, which are lower temperature burns in our burn pile. So we get as much of that charcoal type product as possible.
Great. Here's another question. Could you compare the evapotranspiration use for plants in vineyards versus maybe rangelands versus forests? That's a pretty pretty big question, but
I love this question. I can't do it on the spot, but I know how to do it. So now, now I'm going to take that as a homework assignment to look at comparative ET, and I will get it back to Keith so he can send it to the groups. But let me just make sure I have it right. Forest, rangeland, and vines, right?
yes.
I
If
love
you have
that.
other systems you'd like to throw in, go for it. But
Yes, I'll take on that challenge.
awesome. Thank you. I'm sure people will look forward to that. So just getting this one in, can you discuss the evaluative rubrics or assessment criteria that you utilize to understand trends in aridity with respect to wildfire risk and in relation to landscape types present at Pepperwood, for example?
Yeah, so this is one of the exciting areas of interdisciplinary research where we started modeling this water deficit at a high term, high resolution, which is really great, right? Because I'm a physical scientist. So if you can physically model something that matters in ecosystems, it's a lot easier than measuring the ecosystem. So we are taking live fuel moisture, which is, basically trimming the plants and then looking at the total percent water content in the plants. And that's a very laborious process that can only be done manually at this point. So we're finding that the climatic water deficit is a great predictor of live fuel moisture. It's lagged though in time, right? So it depletes first and then the live fuel moisture depletes. So we've just applied to the Department of Energy actually to scale up that assessment and look at more habitat types, kind of do a coast to crest transect in California where we're making those measurements every week to really get that relationship firmed up. And I will say this was inspired by the fact that after the 2017 fires hit our region, we had the opportunity with NASA to do an analysis. We had a very high resolution LIDAR derived veg model, 5-meter veg model. And we looked at all the different parameters that were correlated to canopy damage. So assuming that where the canopy was lost was some of the most severe fire impacts that we had. And the number one and number two items were the density of ladder fuels, which we estimated using the LIDAR data set, querying the understory, which is not a typical measurement. I think we're the first ones to really try to assess that data. But the density of ladder fuels between 1 and 4 meters, and then the climatic water deficit the month the fires hit, were the two best predictors of fire severity. So it's now folded into the CAL FIRE. One of our TBC3 partners is the author of the model that CAL FIRE is looking at in terms of looking at the impacts of climate on fire hazard, and those changes in water deficits seem to be a really important predictor of where hazard's going to increase.
Great, nice to hear that all that research is getting on the ground.
Well, that's what we try to do, is like we try to do very applied work that answers questions people have right now. So we tap into those great university and ivory tower researchers, but only the ones who want to work on real problems that we're facing today.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, we only have a couple more minutes, and I know Keith actually has a question that he might like to ask you. If you want to jump in there, Keith.
Well, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to stick with one right now. I remember when you presented 8 or 9 years ago, something that really struck with me is, and I know this is just modeling and there's no way to know reality, but you mentioned that like things seem to appear that perhaps around the year, if I have it right, 2070, that our region would look a lot like Santa Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
So that was 10 years ago. So that's more than 10% of the time in between. What would you say the pace of things are as they're actually playing out? And then what's, how fast do you see this sort of drying out or this hydrological change happening now?
Well, I want to put like, quotation marks when we say 2070. We're really like saying 2070 to 2099, because again, it's 30 years of a data point. So we have now traveled, since you first heard my presentation, only 30% through one data point. But without having all the math in front of me, qualitatively, I mean, when we went into the drought, the 5-year drought that ended around 2015, and going into these fire seasons, I mean, we are seeing what we estimated as end of century impacts. And that's what's been kind of hard about this work, is it's not a gradual transition that's happening. We kind of went right into this extremely dry, hot, and difficult weather. So I'd say we're moving faster than we thought, but I can't tell you that's a trend, Keith, because of the variability and the uncertainty in our weather systems. I mean, maybe if we have another meeting 10 years from now, it's going to be like this incredible Arctic vortex that pushed a bunch of rain and cold weather on us that, they're having in Kentucky right now. So, so I'm leery of saying that we're on any particular trajectory. And that's one of the things that people always want to say, well, which one of the models is turning out to be right? But we're always like, you know what, those models are just models, and they represent everything that physically could happen. So we're going to keep measuring and then be able to tell you more accurately what really did happen. But I would say, compared to when I first gave this talk, I thought that these things we've been experiencing the last few years were further away in our future. And I tell people, I wish our models hadn't been right. Like, usually scientists want to be right, but in this case, it would be nice to have been more wrong.
Right. That makes perfect sense. And I think really what's getting people thinking about that is these yearly fires that we're having now, that seem to be further down the road. And really, I've lived here almost 20 years with seeing almost hardly any fires, or well, none of significance, and now they're a yearly occurrence. So I think that has everyone wondering, how fast this is happening. But that was an excellent presentation. I think really helped people who are attending to see where the trends are and where they're going. And I thank you very much for that. And we'll need to talk on our own soon, because we are looking at some of these very same questions of where we're working on a lot of fuel thinning to respond to the fire. And then I'm also talking with growers who are looking at applying mulch, and both in rangelands and vineyard settings. And I see a potential there to really address two things at once and have a more positive outcome. So
I think the more we can work together, the better. And we're all one living system. It's a mosaic of working in wildlands. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to my presentation today. Thank you. And come visit us at Pepperwood. Just contact me, come up for a tour.